Sounds like lunacy to me.
Good, you're right. Maybe they're all a pack of lunatics. Now, read the Sermon on the Mount.
But there is an explanation for it.
If you can read the Sermon on the Mount and conclude that Jesus was a lunatic, you need to listen to Harvard professor Robert Coles, a psychology professor, who pointed out very clearly the ethical teachings of the past 2,000 years are simply footnotes to the Sermon on the Mount. That Sermon on the Mount was not spoken by a lunatic, that's for sure.
Say from 2,000 years ago, from some men that claim that he rose from the dead, is about as valid as a children's storybook about, elephants that could fly. Why do you base, your belief on scripture?
All right. Sir, do you believe Alexander the Great existed?
Yes.
Did you ever see him?
No.
Did you ever talk to him?
I don't disbelieve Jesus' existence. I disbelieve the, acts that are attributed to Jesus.
All right. Well, Alexander the Great lived about 323 BC. The first writings that we have about Alexander the Great are by Plutarch, 400 years after Alexander the Great's life. No reputable historian denies that Alexander the Great really lived, even though the first writing about him is 400 years after the fact. Now, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all written in the first century, 20 to 60 years after Christ lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead. Those Gospels, if you read them, they're not children's stories. The literary style is not fairy tale, it's historical narrative.
That's right.
So, you read them, and it's very clear that he died. A Roman soldier took a spear and jammed it in the side, and we read that a watery serum separate from clotted blood flowed from the side of Christ. He didn't just lapse into unconsciousness, the dude was dead. They take his body off the cross, they put it in a tomb, wrap it in 100 to 120 pounds of burial ointment and white linen, roll a stone in front of the tomb, set a Roman guard to make sure there's no grave robbers doing any hanky-panky. And his followers all are tucking tail and running. They're scared spitless. 3 days after he dies, the record shows, he appeared risen from the dead to women. Women! Sexism is bad today. It was even worse back then. If you wanted to foist a fable on society that a dead Christ had risen from the dead, you wouldn't put a woman as your first eyewitness. That was not the way to gain credibility in that highly sexist, chauvinistic society. But that's who Christ first appeared risen from the dead to. Then he went looking for Peter, the dude who denied him 3 times, knowing. And he appeared to Peter. Peter was willing to die, not for a belief. He died for what he claimed to have seen, the dead Christ risen from the dead. Hundreds of people who saw Christ died at the hands of the Romans, claiming, we saw Jesus risen from the dead, he is Lord, and they died for it.
Sounds like lunacy to me.
Good, you're right. Maybe they're all a pack of lunatics. Now, read the Sermon on the Mount.
But there is an explanation for it.
If you can read the Sermon on the Mount and conclude that Jesus was a lunatic, you need to listen to Harvard professor Robert Coles, a psychology professor, who pointed out very clearly the ethical teachings of the past 2,000 years are simply footnotes to the Sermon on the Mount. That Sermon on the Mount was not spoken by a lunatic, that's for sure. It is so profound ethically, psychologically, it's incredible. But it's possible that they were all a pack of lunatics. But then when you read that Sermon on the Mount, you begin to realize, this is not a lunatic. The worldwide church accepted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as reliable and authoritative. Why? First of all, because they were written by apostles or those who knew the apostles. Secondly, because they were orthodox in their teaching, sticking to the teachings of Christ. And thirdly, because they were used by the whole church repeatedly.
But they didn't write those things together?
No.
John was not sitting next to Luke? Right?
No. John and Luke were not sitting side by side when they wrote. Those documents were written at different times, in different places, by different people. But then the church, the followers of Christ, began to use them with such great repetition that it became a no-brainer. Now, it was not a no-brainer for 2nd and 3rd John. That was not a no-brainer. There was some dispute. over whether those were reliable and authentic or not. And that's why I say it wasn't put together totally over, it was a period of 300 years. Two councils at the end of the 4th century, in 393 and 397, put their stamp of approval on what had already been decided by the worldwide church. But when Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code talks about the Council of Nicaea being the place where the Catholic Church put together the New Testament, that is totally inaccurate. No council put the New Testament together. It was a decision that was arrived at by the churches around the Mediterranean who had apostles, or those who knew the apostles, accepting some of the letters, rejecting others. Obviously, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Pontius Pilate were rejected.
It's Apocrypha, right?
No, those are Gnostic Gospels. Now, the Apocrypha, those are intertestamental books between Malachi and Matthew, that 400-year period, like Maccabees, brave Jewish zealots who rebelled against Rome. So that's the Apocrypha, which is different from the Gnostic Gospels, which are written by people who obviously bought into the philosophy of Gnosticism, which taught the physical is evil, the spiritual is good. Therefore, we reject the Old Testament, we reject the humanity of Christ, we reject his incarnation, we reject his death, and we reject his resurrection, because they're all physical. See, Gnosticism was a philosophy that taught the problem with you is not your sin. The problem with you is you're stupid. You don't have enough knowledge. So the key is more knowledge. That's what gnosis is, knowledge. And so that's why the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic gospel, simply consists of 114 sayings of Jesus. Now, some of them are authentic. They agree with the Gospel of Matthew. But others of them are clearly coming out of Gnostic philosophy. Like, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up a rock, I am there." See, that's not a biblical worldview. That's coming out of mysticism that teaches everything is part of God. And the Bible clearly contradicts that type of mysticism. So, the Bible was not put together in one room, by one council, by the Pope, or by monks, or whoever. It was put together over a long period of time by the eyewitnesses, the apostolic community, those who knew the eyewitnesses, and those who knew them.